Hey there, Skilled Survival Alliance. Welcome to episode number 8 of the Skilled Survival Alliance podcast. Wow, we've got a great topic to discuss today. And everybody will want to stay until the end of today's episode because this information, it applies to every single listener. Yes, even you. So today we're going to discuss survival communications and how important it is to be able to communicate in a it hits the fan scenario and the pros and cons of the different shit hits the fan communication options. Do you know what all your survival communications options are? Getting prepared also means being able to communicate with others during the worst of times. Being able to send and receive critical news and information about what's happening, using this intel to make wise choices. So today we're going to learn why survival communication is important, what our options are, and the pros and cons of each device from our survival expert. Yes, that's right, just in case Jack. How are things, Jack?
Things are great, Brent. I'm excited to talk about survival communications. I always like to say, even if you are literally in the dark, doesn't mean your communications need to be as well.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. People just need to really understand that they have communication options, probably a lot more than they even realize.
Yeah, I agree. There's several communication options and devices to consider when you're preparing. As you mentioned, each has some of their own pros and cons. Some are better at long range, others at shorter ranges. Some are more expensive than others. Some take a lot more intelligence and upfront time investment. Some require licenses, some don't. It just really ultimately depends on what your survival goals are.
Yeah, that's a good point. So really you have to kind of know what your end goal is when you're deciding what the best option is for you.
Yeah, exactly. I always suggest getting the goal in mind before committing to a process. Otherwise you really don't know when you've accomplished your task. You want to drive towards, okay, now I'm at this point in my goal and here I've accomplished my goal and you're now prepared for that.
Right. Now, so I guess the first thing is, what should people's goals be in regards to survival communications?
So in my opinion, the number one goal is to know what the hell is happening, right? It doesn't matter if it's a small emergency or a large emergency or a shit hits the fan scenario. If you don't have good intelligence information, then you are in the dark from an information standpoint. It doesn't matter if your plan is to bug in or bug out. You want information. You can't rely on our most popular systems of communication today. People get most of their news information from TV and the 24-hour news cycle and also the internet. Both of these options are, for the most part, dependent upon grid power to function. Now, I'm not suggesting that electricity won't be available for all shit hits the fan scenarios. It's possible that grid power is sorted out at some point, but I don't like to take gambles when I prepare. I prepare and assume the worst case and hope for the best. That means I will assume the worst, and that would be no grid power. I want my communications to be available and work without having to rely on grid power. That's the goal. That's my primary goal, and that should be your primary goal as well.
That's an excellent way to put it, Jack. And, like you said, why assume that you're going to get power? I mean, this is what prepping's all about, right? You're preparing for the worst
Yep.
so you can, survive and thrive.
Exactly. It's for communications, that's what it's all about. It's about being able to communicate without grid power.
Right. So now that we have our primary goal, what are some of the secondary goals?
For a secondary goal, it can depend on your personal situation a little more. So for me, my secondary goal is to be able to listen and broadcast. Okay.
Okay.
I want to be able to have a two-way conversation with others if necessary. I want to be able to ask specific questions. I want to be able to hone in on what's really going on. And I want to talk to other people who are prepared across my region.
Gotcha.
I want to be able to discuss and talk about meetup locations and where threats are. And all these take a two-way type of conversation. However, that kind of setup, it takes a much bigger level of commitment to get to that level of communication. For some, that may be way more than they want. And to be honest, if you're just getting into this, you want to start with an easier secondary goal. This is one that you could work up to over time, but not one you're going to be able to implement in one day.
Right.
But that's okay. I would say this to everyone out there. Your secondary goal, I think, at a minimum, needs to be to have a listen-only communication device and the ability to listen only. So that would not be a two-way conversation. That would be a one-way conversation where you are silent. So that's a much easier goal to accomplish and one you can really accomplish very quickly.
Right.
So even if you can't have a conversation, you still want to be able to tune into someone else's broadcast and take that information and use it for your own adjustments to what you have going on.
Right. It could save you that long trip to Atlanta to find out that it's just overrun by zombies.
That's a great point. Obviously, it's a show, The Walking Dead, early in the season, but that is a great example of where communications would have, altered decisions that were made. Good communications will do that. It'll keep you out of harm's way.
It can help. It can help.
It,
keep you
it
out of
can
harm's
help.
way.
So those are the two main goals. So to break it down, number one is to have grid independent communications. And goal number two is decide if you want to have a conversation or listen only. Once you know this, you can start getting your plan in place from there.
Yeah, that's perfect. That makes it really, really simple for our listeners to have those two goals.
That's how I always try to do that. I always try and kind of cut through the crap and get to the heart of the problem, and then we can move forward with confidence and put some actions in place.
All right. Now that we have our goals in mind, why don't we start going through the pros and cons of some of the survival communication devices? I'd say maybe let's start with the most prevalent communication devices in our modern world today. I think you've got one and I've got two. I hate to say, but cell phones, smartphones.
Yeah, you bet. Now, I'm betting most of our listeners thinking about the smartphone or cell phone are going to be a little surprised when I say that I love the smartphone for many survival and emergency situations.
Really?
Yeah, that's right. The smartphone is a solid emergency tool most of the time.
Right.
Just think about it for a minute. Before the cell phone, when a localized emergency event occurred, it took much longer to get help. I'm obviously not talking about a shit hits the fan scenario here. I'm talking about car crashes. I'm talking about getting robbed, mugged, or an attack on the street. I'm
Right.
talking about individual, localized, urban-based emergency events.
Right.
The nice thing about the cell phone or smartphone, it's practically attached to most people by the hip. People take it every single day. I would say it's the single most popular everyday carry gadget by far, and it's saved countless lives since its broad adoption.
I'd agree.
Now, with that said, the smartphone is the worst shit hits the fan scenario survival communication device there is.
Yeah, I can see how maybe it's a bit of a double-edged sword, especially with society today and their absolute addiction to it.
So like I said, it's really nice for those smaller emergencies, and I'm about to tell you why it sucks. Absolutely, it's terrible for larger scale type of events, and that's the problem. People don't realize how bad it is for those events, so they think that it's gonna be good in all kinds of scenarios. But if we just look to recent history, which we'll talk about in a minute, that is not the truth.
All right. Well, let's just jump right into one of those examples.
Sure. It's notorious for phone networks to jam, and that's what I'm talking about. When major events happen, think about Hurricane Katrina, the Boston Marathon bombing, the first thing everyone did and does is reach for their cell phones.
I mean,
It's
that's
just
even
natural.
that's even apparent when you're at a football game or any major gathering.
Exactly. At sporting events, especially popular ones like, let's say, a college football game tailgate or something, you have a ton of college-age kids that are all calling and texting like crazy. Every single one of them has a cell phone. That turns into a short-term network jam. Stuff can't get through. People can't call each other and meet up and stuff like that. That happens every single weekend in the fall at most college campuses nowadays. So yeah, it doesn't even take a major emergency event. It just takes a lot of people trying to call or text all at the same time. So basically, in this kind of scenario, no calls get in, no calls get out. So what do you think is going to happen when the shit hits the fan? Immediate and prolonged communication failure will occur with cell phones. It's just going to become a big old paperweight, basically. The other concern with cell phone networks is the networks themselves are dependent on constant electricity. Now, these systems, for the most part, have battery and generator backup systems in place, but those are only temporary solutions to this problem. Okay, so that is going to work for like the afternoon power outage. That is going to work for the 2-day power outage even. So it takes fuel or recharging to keep these backup systems running and keep some power going to them if the grid is out. And those systems, those backup systems require people to be involved, right? They have to either go put fuel in the generator or somehow go and make sure that the batteries are getting recharged in whatever way that they're designed. Well, how many people will be willing to keep those generators topped off when the shit hits the fan? They themselves are fearful of their own lives and their families' lives, right?
Right.
No one. If it's bad enough, those people are going to be concerned with their own personal situations, and they're not going to be running around town, in a truck trying to fill up all these backup generators, right? That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, unless you're really addicted to Angry Birds. But for the most part, you're right. It's not going to happen. And for the last 2 weeks or so, I've been walking around with my phone when the battery is totally reached its end of life. So I'll charge my smartphone, and less than 2 hours later, if I'm lucky, and usually less than an hour later, that thing is 100% dead. It is a brick. It's a paperweight. And I'll tell you that there's not a lot of value to that cell phone when it's in my pocket, fully dead.
Yeah.
So, if there's no, like you said, if there's no power source to keep that thing charged, it's not going to last a long time. And so you better get, your situation sorted out real quick before that power goes out.
Yeah, for major nationwide emergency situations that might even be prolonged, the smartphone turns into a dumb phone.
Exactly. Now, one thing I do remember reading around Hurricane Katrina time was that people were trying to make phone calls on the network, and the network was just jammed, and they weren't making any phone calls. But the people that were trying to text, it eventually got through, just based on kind of how the mechanics of one works versus the other. So, that's something to consider if you're in a scenario where the cell phone networks are just jammed because of, too many people or everyone using their cell phone at once. Try the text message. There's no guarantee that it's going to get through, but there have been instances in the past where the text messages are continuing to flow, and the voice calls aren't. So just something to keep in mind there.
Worth trying. I mean, at the worst, it doesn't work,
Right.
but don't rely on it.
Exactly.
Right? Don't assume that's going to work.
Right. So basically, we've determined that cell phones are great, but they're also really, really bad for an all-out shit hits the fan, or even just a moderate emergency. So what are some other options here?
Okay, so the next option I want to cover is one that is the best for the majority of people. It might not be the best communication situation if you're looking to have all options, but I think this option is the one that most people can adapt very quickly and get themselves in a better position without a ton of extra effort. It's a listen-only device, but it's 100% grid independent, which, remember, is the number one goal we talked about earlier. It's the hand crank AM/FM weather band radio. This device should be purchased by every single survivalist and prepper out there. It's similar to how I always recommend the Life Straw for water purification. Just one of those devices that's basically a no-brainer. You should purchase it. The reason is that when shit hits the fan and TV and internet are down, you can still pull out your hand crank radio, crank it a few times, and that'll give it some power. That hand crank device is what powers it. It's got its own little hand crank generator on the device. And when you turn it on and listen to any stations or news channels, and you can hear any that happen to be broadcasting, and obviously in any major emergency event, those broadcast stations will be sending out some signals with some details about what the heck's going on. God forbid if there happened to be some kind of nuclear attack in a city nearby you, the power grid's probably going to be out, but some of the broadcasters will have backup systems, and you'll be able to crank your radio, kick it on, and be able to know where the hell that explosion happened, where the fallout's running, and avoid all those kind of scenarios. And that's just one idea, right? It could be a lot of different shit hits the fan scenarios, but basically the more information you have, the better decisions you can make. The other great news about it is they don't cost that much. We're talking somewhere in the $30 range. So there's a chance when a big, broad, nationwide type of event kicks the power out, and I'm not sure every radio station has great backup systems or not. I don't really have that knowledge. However, at some point, people will get some emergency broadcasts going, and then you'll be able to listen to that information. Even a little bit of information can put you at a huge advantage.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, being able to remove that link to the power source by having the hand crank, makes that a great option for basically any scenario. I just want to make sure everybody who's listening knows that Jason, survival expert and mountain rescue man, he did a great review video on one of the hand crank radios. So head back to the Skilled Survival Alliance dashboard and scroll down to the gear review section, and you'll see a video there where he walks you through what it's like to have one of these little bad boys. And like Jack said, $30. It's a great peace of mind. It's a great tool to have with you in your bug out bag, even when you go camping. So $30, pick one up today. Amazon Prime, probably get it with free shipping. So really no excuses. If you don't have one, put it on your list and get one. So, all right, that's 2 devices down. What's next?
All right, before we get into the rest options, I want to stop and let everybody know that the rest of the devices, unfortunately, need some form of electricity to function. Now, they don't necessarily require grid power, but they do require power. So in order to implement any of the following devices, you're going to need some form of electricity generation. Personally, I recommend that you get a few different electrical backup systems in place, for this communication piece as well as for some other prepping type systems. And you want to have some form of power when the grid is down. It's not going to be as convenient and it's not going to be as prevalent as grid power. I get that. But some form of small amounts of power is recommended. But that's where the price begins to go up. And I mentioned that earlier in the podcast. And that's where things start to really get a little more complex. So that's what we're going to dive into a little bit here going forward. But so the power generation systems I recommend, just really, really high level surface stuff here, is a simple survival generator in combination with some bulk fuel storage, right? That's going to be good for your 2 or 3 day power outage in the winter because a storm went through. That's going to be good for on and off electrical needs over a longer period of time as well. You also want some kind of array of solar panels and a battery bank to collect that energy. And because that's just free energy, right? So you go ahead and get those batteries charged up with some solar and then use that as needed periodically throughout the days and weeks and months. Depending on where you live and if you can put the system in place, a small wind turbine, basically it's not free to install and you do have to maintain it, but it will provide ongoing energy from time to time that you can utilize. And if you're on land with the possibility of a hydropower setup, so that's water flowing where you put a pump in and you take advantage of the current from the water to turn a small turbine and provide some energy. Obviously, those are more rare. You have to be in the right kind of land situation to be able to harness that. But if that's possible, that's a real gem. That's something I recommend people look for in their bug out location if possible. So you can have a little bit of energy even in a remote rural area that doesn't depend on grid power at all. But like I said, you need a fast moving stream that's close enough to your home to harness that power. So those are the 4 systems that I typically like to recommend for kind of off-grid type power situations. And that's really all I'm going to say about power generation today. Just know that the following communication devices unfortunately don't have hand cranks. I sure wish they did. That would be sweet, but you'd be probably cranking continuously for days just to get enough power to power these types of devices. They just take a lot more power than that small hand crank radio.
Yeah, you'd have to really blow through your food supply because you'd need to have enough calories to keep cranking those.
Yeah, maybe you can just assign one of your kids to crank all day.
To have kids.
There you go.
Do some work.
That's right. Get into the devices now. So one local device that a lot of preppers get, especially if they have like a small coalition, is walkie-talkies. So the nice thing about walkie-talkies is they're great for a small local group communication. They're an awesome communication tool for the right sized survival group. Like a tight-knit survival group that all lives maybe in the same square mile or so. It's really great. Being able to talk with your survival coalition up to a couple miles distance is powerful. However, you just heard one of the biggest cons in there, distance. Walkie-talkies are limited to a few miles in range. It depends on the brand, the model, the environment you're in. If you're in surroundings with a lot of buildings, that signal won't go as far. If you're in open space, it'll go a lot further. But even in the best conditions, you're talking probably not more than 30 miles from walkie-talkies, even in ideal setup conditions. Really, there's only one way to get more distance from a walkie-talkie, and it's called a repeater. Now, the problem with a repeater, basically how a repeater works first is a repeater takes the walkie-talkie signal, repeats it, and uses some amplification and electricity, again, back to that electricity, to send a bigger signal out, right? So it basically repeats it and throws the signal further. So to get really far, you need multiple repeaters. However, repeaters are expensive and they require constant power. Both of those are not good for the kind of scenarios we're talking about. So again, for local survival coalition communications, they're great, but that's about it. They don't have hand cranks, so again, you'll need some electrical backup systems, and you won't be getting national or regional communications at all with walkie-talkies. I also lump CB radios and scanners into the same camp as walkie-talkies. CB radios do have a longer range than walkie-talkies, but they're not typically as mobile as walkie-talkies. They usually have bigger base stations that they operate from. That's why truckers have them installed up in their cabs for their trucks, so they get better range from those. But they're not putting them on their hip and walking around with them. One final pro for all of these local frequency options is that you can purchase, set up, and use most of them without getting a license. Okay, so we haven't gotten into that at all yet. We will shortly. But basically, you don't have to go through any kind of a licensing or testing process in order to use and operate these. Now, you got to be a little bit careful here because some frequencies are licensed, especially if you get into urban environments where there's, for instance, baseball stadiums, warehouses, and manufacturers. Those types of places, they do license certain frequencies for their walkie-talkie systems. And if you happen to be using your local walkie-talkies in their range, they will hear you if you encroach on them, and then they can take legal action against you for that. So you'll need to look into that a little more carefully. If you're in a rural setting, it's really not an issue at all. So of those options, I like the walkie-talkie best for their mobility feature.
Nice. Those are a lot of great options. So we've covered some listen only and we covered some of the local communication options. What else is there?
Yeah, I'm going to cover the last option, which if you're serious about prepping, if you want to really get to the highest level of options, it's going to be your ham radio setup. Okay.
Right.
Ham radios are amazing. They are a fantastic way to communicate over very long distances. I mean, people are able to communicate with ham radio setups all the way around the world, essentially. Definitely across a nation and regionally, no problem. It's two-way communication. Okay, so it's not just listen only. We're into a broadcast and gleaning information. You're actually able to ask questions. You're able to talk to other people in other parts of the country. And many of those people, these are the kind of people who know what's going on, or at least are of the same kind of mindset as we are. It goes really well with survivalists and being prepared and ham radio operators. Now, I'm not going to suggest that every ham radio operator is prepping in a survivalist, but they tend to be in that same mindset and camp. So they're kind of people you want to get to know and talk to. The way ham radio works is essentially it's a radio system where there's nationwide frequency bands that you can tap into and use those bands, and other people can use those bands to communicate like walkie-talkies, basically, to keep it really, really simple. It's a little different and there's a lot more detail, but no reason to dive into all that. Just the basics that you need to know today are that the ham radio is the ultimate survival communication tool. Another thing that is nice about ham radio is since most people who communicate on are local and prepared minded, many of these people are going to have backup systems similar to the ones I shared earlier. And so even if grid powers down, there's going to be many, many people who are still able to fire up their ham radio, start sending out some signals, asking if there's other people on these frequencies, and be able to start talking on an individual to individual basis what the heck's going on out there, right? So and some bigger authority type broadcasts, maybe if the government is still around and is broadcasting some information, they would be able to broadcast on ham radio as well. So very, very cool. Best survival communication device there is. The downside, again, is the electricity. It's not mobile, so it needs power. It's not mobile, and it does require a license to operate. There's a little bit of controversy around the licenses. And here's what it is. A lot of people say, why the hell do I need a license when the shit hits the fan? Nobody's going to be out there regulating licenses, right? You'll be able to fire up your ham radio, turn it on, start talking to people, and nobody's going to come knocking on your door saying, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. It's illegal. No, they'll be, people will be in panic. Nobody's going to be regulating that. And I agree with that. But I would also say that if you want to be proficient at using ham radio, there's more to it than it sounds. It's not just turn it on and find a frequency band. There's other things you need to understand about setting up your antenna. There's more stuff you need to learn about how to actually dial into the frequencies. And there's a lot more to it than just that. So my recommendation, if you're going to go after this, is to go ahead and get your license. It's not really that hard. In the show notes, I'll link to a page that gives you the specifics, but basically you just have to take a test. There's multiple levels of efficiency, if you will, or there's multiple levels of stature. And so there's different tests for that. But the first test is pretty easy. It's really simple. It's easy to study for. So you can get your ham radio license with a minimal amount of study time. Right. And then you'll be able to, go on and listen only at first. And then eventually you'll be able to broadcast as well. So that's the communication device that people are going to want to go after if they want the ultimate survival communication device.
That makes sense. So I know we've covered it a couple times already, but it's worth just noting so it's loud and clear. Ham radios do require licensing, so definitely check those links in the show notes to see how to go about doing that. And we should definitely have Jason come on and do an episode of the podcast all about ham radio because he's licensed, right?
He is licensed. I'm working on mine. It's something that I've always wanted to do. It's just kind of been on the back burner for a while. But yeah, Jason, he's had his for a while, so he knows on a technical side basis. So yeah, I think we should have him on. Maybe the next episode or at least next episode or two, we have him on and pick his brain about ham radio.
Roger that. All right, Jack. Well, I think we've covered quite a bit today in terms of survival communication. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I just want to say, based on your goals, you can take action today, right? With the first goal, get yourself a hand crank radio. Done. Check that box. Moving on. And if you have that second goal in mind of being able to have two-way conversation, then you need to investigate the ham radio. We'll get the licensing information up on the show notes, and you can start taking action today on that as well.
Sounds great, Jack. Well, there you have it, Skilled Survival Alliance. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Skilled Survival Alliance podcast, where we talked all about communication radios. Make sure to check out those show notes below. And just like we always say, prepare, adapt, and overcome.